Welcome back to the Women in Preservation Symposium 2021, and welcome to the panel, Speaking of Languages, Ensuring that Languages of Yesterday are Spoken Tomorrow. We want to thank Michelle Delaney and Elizabeth Lay for inviting us here today, and thank all of you for attending. My name is Mary Linn, and I'm coming to you from Maryland, outside of DC. I am on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Piscataway people and their brethren, who shared fishing, hunting, and gathering rights in the Potomac and Anacostia watersheds. The Piscataway people are alive and flourishing members of the DC community today. In this time that we are together virtually rather than in person, I urge all of you to continue to seek and understand the history and the present of the land on which you stand, and acknowledge the Indigenous people who have been living and working on that land from time immemorial. With me today are Ka'iulani Laeha from Aha Punana Leo on the Big Island of Hawaii, and Siri Tuttle from the Alaska Native Language Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Our professional bios are on the Women in Preservation website. However, we would like to give a more personal introduction to ourselves and how we came to language work. After our introductions, we will each talk for about 10 minutes and have some short discussion about the issues we bring up. Then we will open it to your questions. We invite you to post your questions in the question and answer box at the top or bottom of your screens. I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, the third daughter and the fourth child of a social worker and a school teacher. So service and education were instilled in me from a young age, along with the love of family history, outdoors, and music. I volunteered at the local historical museum when I was 12 and worked in museums and archives throughout my college years. I went to a public university, all of them, where I majored in American Studies and later in linguistics. I had been teaching English as a second language for several years before my mentor, Akira Yamamoto, asked me to go with him to Oklahoma to help native language teachers develop teaching materials for 1 month in one summer. This experience changed my life. The passion and profound sense of connection that these women, and at that time they were all women, had to their languages, well, we'll just put it this way, I never taught English again. I have been blessed to work with many Native people in Oklahoma and across the United States and Canada. And since moving to the Smithsonian with European community scholars and Tibetans in China as well. I come to my work from an academic tradition called Americanist linguistics, and my Smithsonian home in the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Both of these emphasize a commitment to community voice in documentation and description of language situated in everyday life, and being an ally to help Indigenous and minoritized people working in language and cultural sustainability. Through research in language revitalization, training for future generations of community linguists, and changing the narrative about multilingualism and language rights in the United States. Ka'iulani, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm really excited for the panel today. Aloha mai kako o wau Ka'iulani Laeha no Oahu Maio. I'm Ka'iulani Laeha. I'm the CEO of Aha Punana Leo. I'm from the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Our main office for our organization is on the Hawaii island, the Big Island of Hawaii. And we are a nonprofit who's been focused on Hawaiian language revitalization efforts for about 38 years now. So I'm really blessed to be a part of this organization. And I was privileged to be able to go to a school who gives preference to Native Hawaiian students since I was in kindergarten, and that's where I was first introduced to Hawaiian language. And as I grew up into my professional career, I always had a real strong love and passion for Olala Hawaii or Hawaiian language. And I was, able to have this opportunity to work for an organization who focuses on just that. So that's just a little bit about me. Thank you so much.
Mahalo. Siri?
Siri Tuttle se ojra. Tenhot Ananankara Dara this stock Anistinith Koda Honiskeich. I said, my name is Siri Tuttle. I am speaking to you from where I live and work on the land of the Tanana Dene. I said it in that language because we often try to introduce ourselves in the language that we work with. Sometimes it's a little awkward because for an outsider to be speaking that language can feel wrong. On the other hand, we always do it a little bit wrong so that somebody can correct us, and that's a good thing. I've been in love with languages since I was about 5 years old and sat listening to records of people singing in different languages and trying to copy them, and trying to learn languages out of books that I got in the library just randomly. Well, why not Welsh? Why not? So I grew up with a fascination with languages and didn't really settle into a way to work with it productively until I was actually in getting ready to go to graduate school. But I had done work as an undergraduate, studying poetry, looking at this, looking at that, looking at the other thing. But somebody told me about this place in Alaska where they have a language center. And they actually, all of them study the languages of Alaska, all of them, all 21 of them. And I was like, I want to work there. I want to work there. Well, it took a long time to get there, but eventually I got my wish after going through graduate school at the University of Washington and learning that I really liked the Dene languages the best because they were the hardest. Not really, but that's what I thought at the time. I did get my wish, and I've been working at the Alaska Native Language Center since 2003. But I've been visiting Alaska for much longer than that, since early in the 90s, just to visit the people and talk with them in the languages. My fascination is with the people who are doing the work with language, and in places where you have very tiny numbers of people trying to hold together a language, it becomes deeply moving and really exciting, actually. So that's what I do. Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for this symposium. Thank you, Mary, for a wonderful introduction. Basijo.
Sanlei, that was in Yuchi. Thank you, Siri. Okay, we'll get started on the talks now. I get to go first in this wonderful panel. So when Michelle Delaney first asked me to speak on women in preservation, I said, sure, but I don't do preservation. And this may seem odd for somebody who works in a museum. And when it is common to hear in media that someone, usually an elder, is preserving their language, especially their endangered language. I work in language revitalization and maintenance, and I am an ally to language reclamation. To explain, we don't and can't preserve languages. Languages are living entities that are constantly changing. Language documentation and description, and that's the recording of speakers of a language and using this information to create grammars, dictionaries, and teaching materials. We can do that, but this record is only a snapshot of the language at a certain moment in time, usually with a very few speakers and at a certain place in time as well. We can talk about preserving the documentation formats and the descriptions housed in libraries, archives, and museums. My colleague Siri will talk more about archives and their role in preserving and revitalizing language materials. In our field, we talk about maintaining languages in bilingual or multilingual contexts where the people may be fully multilingual, but language is always under pressure from larger or more politically or economically powerful languages. We talk about revitalization activities in communities that are missing a generation or more of people who grew up speaking that language in the home and daily life. The reasons for these shifts to dominant languages are not accidental, but stem from many years of laws rooted in racism, forced removals and loss of land, oppression from dominant society, and overwhelming economic disenfranchisement that leads to urbanization. Depending on the size of a community and their resources, both human and monetary, there are different approaches that can be used to revitalize a language. My colleague, Ka'iolani, will talk about the language nest and immersion school approach to revitalizing her Hawaiian language, and I will talk about another approach later on. More recently, we use the term reclamation to encompass the larger decolonialization efforts in communities that include language or are situated in language work. First used in this sense by Wesley Leonard, a citizen of the Miamia or Miami Nation. He states, reclamation begins in community history and contemporary needs, which are determined by community agents. Reclamation calls for an ecological approach to language work, one that recognizes how language is never independent from the environment in which its speakers and potential future speakers live. Thus, reclamation is about community building and self-empowerment or re-empowerment through language, lifeways, and land. It is important to make this distinction in terminology between preservation and revitalization. Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians are too often relegated to the past and as non-agents in their history through the way that they are talked about in academia and museums, in advertising and media, and in mascots. By changing our terminology, we acknowledge their continued existence and recognize the tremendous reclamation movement that they've started and work that is being done at home and all over the world. But documentation and revitalization are related, and my work does still overlap with both. And I will give two examples of this in my work at the Smithsonian. Backing up a little bit, the first language collections of indigenous languages archived in the United States are those at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia and from the Bureau of American Ethnology, now the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian. These collections were mainly wordless, mainly created to determine language families and the relationships between tribes that could inform the Secretary of State and others about policy, war, and expansion. Franz Boas and his Americanist students in the early 1900s ushered in a new view to record the languages on their own terms and not described in terms of deficit comparisons to European languages. They also concentrated on collecting texts and narratives, thus relying on relationships with speakers and introducing the native point of view and voice. You can put up the first slide. This is one of Franz Boas' students, Mary Haas. Having documented the last fluent speakers of several languages in the American South, she started the first collection dedicated to indigenous languages at a university. This model, it continues today, as we'll see with the collection that Siri talks about. Many of these early linguists, anthropologists, and musicologists, including Francis Dinsmore that Richard Curran talked about right before this panel, they formed their collections in an extractive manner, meaning taking from the community and not really giving back into the community. And their collections were imbued with a sense of salvage linguistics, the idea that all native languages and cultures were about to die, so collect to preserve their information for science. Thus, the introduction of the term preserve a language. While they were working in their own time frame and did not necessarily know the consequences in the future of native languages, we are still working today to undo some of this legacy and harm. However, these collections are truly invaluable today, especially for the communities who no longer have any fluent first language speakers. Next slide. The breath of life approach was developed by L. Frank, who's Tongva Indian from California, and Leanne Hinton to renew the languages that no longer had any fluent first language speakers from archival materials. Let me introduce you now to some more terminology if you have patience. If a language no longer has fluent first language speakers, we do not say the language is dead or extinct, but it is a sleeping language. A language is only dead if, 1, there is no documentation at all, and 2, there is no community who identifies with it. If a language has both of these, then it can be renewed or revived, as shown in the case of the Miamia and the Wampanoag languages in the US that went from no speakers to a strong core of new speakers. It had no had no fluent first language speakers, but now have strong core of new speakers and some children for whom it is their first language. Breath of Life workshops take place in and with archives and museums. Community participants work with archivists to find materials. They receive some training in linguistics, especially how to read early linguistic field notes, and are paired with a linguistic partner for constant help throughout the week of wading through these linguistic materials. Breath of Life workshops have taken place in California, where they originated, Oklahoma, and the National Breath of Life Institute at the Smithsonian. Breath of Life researchers or participants have changed archives as much as access to their own language materials have changed their reclamation efforts. First, they have changed the archive terminology from workshop participants or archive visitors to become community researchers. As researchers, they are equal to any other learned researchers. They are considered experts on their community's languages, knowledge for metadata on the resources, and have aided archivists in access restrictions, closing some things that are sacred or restricted content that should not be in public view. They have pushed archives to digitize native language collections faster. Next slide. Community researchers don't just access language materials, but anything that has their language in it: maps, botanical collections, and material culture. In this photograph is a picture of a now dear friend of mine, Charmaine Baker. I was her linguistic partner for A Breath of Life. In the National Anthropological Archive, she found a map that included her family encampment on an early map of Nebraska. And I cannot tell you how emotional this was to her, how it connected her tangibly to her ancestors, and how important this map is to the Ponca people. Next slide. At another National Breath of Life in Washington, D.C., Myra Halverson, a citizen of the Sugbiak-Lutuk Nation, and her colleague, Michael Bach, pictured here, found one and only one short manuscript in the Alutiiq language. The translation gave a rather disconnected narrative, and it was immediately valuable for their efforts back home as a story and for the language contained within it. But instead of digging into that language, Myra struggled with who the storyteller was and why he told that story. The contributor, after all, was far away from his home when he told the story to a linguist. Slowly, they could give a name and family reference to the story, to the storyteller. They began to see several meanings to the story beyond the translation provided to the linguist. In a way, what they found was a message for those who knew how to listen. And like all good stories, it was rich in possible interpretations and connections to their lives today. His voice reached across time and touched them. No archivist can work with Breath of Life researchers and feel the same about the materials in their care. They can never again look at holdings as just data or objects again, but they see them as living documents. Finally, Breath of Life researchers provide instructions for traditional care of collections and material culture. Again, as seen in this slide, Myra is pointing out exact species in some of the materials in the collection. And as you can see, there's a small stone Sugbiak whale oil lamp. There were quite a few of these in the collections, and Myra told the collections personnel that these should be stored face down so that the spirit of the lamp would not escape. By the end of the session, all the lamps in the collection were face down. By including traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge, language archives are more integrated with other collections, reflecting the seamlessness of language, culture, and a natural environment that follows the philosophy of language found in most indigenous communities. Another change in the relationship between preservation and revitalization is in who gets to create the record, whose story gets told, and by whose point of view. Historically, the record was made by outside male researchers who often worked with male consultants. Next slide. An early and very notable exception to this was Aneptu Wastawin, also known as Ella Deloria, a Yankton Dakota linguist and anthropologist who worked to have people understand her Yankton life and worldview. Next slide. But in many cases, the record of a language contains no vocabulary associated with women on childbirth or childcare or even childhood, gardening or small farming if this was women's work, food preparation and preserving food. In many cases, in one particular that I know of, there are no recorded words for any female body parts. In addition, linguists are also interested in the unusual grammatical structures of a language. Siri touched about this as well. I mean, we just love these complicated languages. But what makes them unique or exotic in comparison to other languages are not really what's needed for language revitalization. To get a language back into daily use, people need the everyday, the usual, the mundane that's found in normal conversations. And finally, we know that the record is always richer when family or friends are doing the asking and the recording. So part of my work at the Smithsonian is training young people in the US and now Tibetans in China, and being sure to include an equal number of female students, to document their language through natural everyday life and to record what they find meaningful to learn and pass on. Next slide. So actually the slide before it, I kind of would like to say a few words. This is from our Nomad Material Culture Project, which underwrote young Tibetans to create large documentation project in their own languages. And this is part of our cultural sustainability at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Okay, now you can go to the next slide. Because most women do not normally narrate what they're doing while they're doing it, such as the woman making flour or other daily tasks, we also train students to show their videos to their consultants. Here is a family in Sichuan looking at the documentation and providing more information from the two young linguists in their family who were part of a Sichuan training workshop. One of the students is behind the camera and one is at the table holding the audio recording equipment for this session. The methodology is that once you have the beautiful video of the material culture or somebody doing a daily task, then you watch that with a consultant and hopefully other people as well. The first time you watch it, you have the group talk about it. Was it a typical occurrence of the task? Was it good or not good? What were the materials used? And then you watch it another time and have somebody really narrate what they're doing step by step. And this way you can get a lot of specialized vocabulary, such as words for grind or pestle or wheat germ in the other photo. But as you can tell, it is also a fun activity and brings more awareness and pride in their language and culture. In short, the record making itself, the preservation part, becomes part of revitalization and thus part of the agency or reclamation of their language future. And I'm going to pass it right now to Kaiulani for her talk. Thank you.
Mahalo, Mary. That was so interesting to watch and to learn about all the different, terms and all of that. I loved hearing all that. Thank you for sharing. I guess I'll start with a little background to give us some context on, again, Aha Punana Leo, which is the organization that I am with. I think it's important to understand for us to know why we needed to revitalize Hawaiian language in Hawaii. And in the 19th century, Hawaii was one of the most literate nations in the world, and Hawaiian language was being used everywhere. We had a really strong education system, and it was really important to our people to be able to read and write and speak. And like I said, it was very frequently used in a variety of settings. And following the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, there was a law that came into act a few years later that mandated that English shall be the language that should be used in all settings for public education. And that was really devastating for Hawaiian language, as we've seen for many other languages around the world, really, that something like that can really quickly diminish the amount of people who speak the language and who know the language. So about 100 years after that, Aha Punana Leo was founded in 1983. There were less than 50 speakers under the age of 18 who could speak Hawaiian. So the language wasn't dead. It wasn't quite sleeping yet, like Mary was talking about earlier. But we were really on the cusp of losing our language and not having a strong connection back to it. So the founders of Aha Punana Leo were a small group, like what you were speaking about earlier too, Mary. It was a small group of very dedicated, it was parents, it was families, young families that wanted to make sure that they were able to raise their children through Hawaiian language. And they came up with a strategy, which is commonly known as language nests. And they used the kupuna, or our elders in our community who could still speak, and put them together with the babies and created kind of a childcare facility, and it grew into a licensed preschool. And that's how we started to pass on the language to new generations, to hopefully get to someplace where we could have fluent Hawaiian language speakers. And that was really the goal for Aha Punana Leo. And I have a short clip of a video that I was hoping to share with everyone now, and it kind of just goes over some of that. So you guys can see some of the keiki speaking, and some of the kumu speaking Olelo Hawaii. You can go ahead and play that now.
O ka punana leo ka honua no na kamali'i a me na ohana e ho'oulu ai I ka mauliola Hawaii ma ko kākou ōlelo Hawaii, ka ōlelo o kia ʻaina. O ka pahuhopu nui e ola ka ōlelo Hawaii. Oh, mai kai.
100 years after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the government oppression of our language, and nearly 3 generations of very few native speakers, the Punana Leo were started as a means to save our ōlelo Hawaii, our Hawaiian language.
O ke ki'ina a me ke ka'akalai ho'i I ki'i ia, o ia ho'i ke ki'i ia o nā mana leo, nā kanaka makaukau maka ōlelo, a nā lākou no e hānai aku I nā pepe, nā punua ho'i I ke ia ōlelo o kākou.
Aloha, o ka mehu kahalo, o ka uinoa.
These Punana Leo preschools build on this strong foundation of language fluency to provide a stimulating educational environment.
O ka imi na awa ma ke ia papahana Punana Leo, kukulu ia ma luna o ke kahi kālai I ke ku'una Hawaii. A ole loa ka awale iki.
Ma la ma ke keiki I ke kalo.
Mai ka iwa.
Mahalo for playing that. So that was just a short clip from one of our videos. It's up on YouTube if anyone is interested in watching the rest of it. It goes on into sharing a little bit about our Hakalama literacy program that we implement at all of our preschool sites that really helps the children develop really great reading skills at an early age, and they actually leave our program ready for kindergarten, able to read paragraphs, which is really awesome just because of how our language is set up. But that was just a little clip for everyone to see. And since the time that Aha Punana Leo started with having just a handful of speakers, we now have over 20,000 who self-report as Hawaiian language speakers. So that's a really, really great indication that we've had some success with our program over the years. And we remain the only statewide Hawaiian medium education preschool. We have 12 sites throughout the state, and we're on all of the main Hawaiian islands. And we've also helped forge the way for public education to have a Hawaiian medium or Hawaiian language pathway through their immersion schools in the DOE system. And we have a great consortium partnership with a charter school in Navahi o Colonial Pu'u, and also Kahaku'ula, which is the Hawaiian Language College at the University of Hawaii Hilo campus, which allows for individuals to go from P through 20, so all the way up to doctoral degree through the medium of Hawaiian language. So those are really significant milestones for our community. And for me, I think one of the more impactful things is that because of the failures that we've had and we've overcome and the successes that we've found, we are now able to work with and support other language programs from around the world that are facing similar challenges and might just want to learn a little bit more about our strategies. And in a typical year, not 2020 or 2021, obviously, but we usually host over 200 visitors from different communities throughout the world that just come and see our programs and want to, learn a little bit and just witness it themselves to see what's possible. And as you can imagine, this was no easy task. It wasn't. It was much harder than the already difficult task of starting a small business that you're kind of fighting against the grain. But our founders, our board members, our staff, and all of the families involved needed to be advocates for Hawaiian language. In some cases, activists for language to change laws and develop curriculum and recruit staff who definitely had a strong passion and love for language, but may not have had the experience for the job roles that we needed. So it was a really interesting road that Aha Punana Leo has been on, but we know that there's a lot ahead as well.
Mahalo. That was really interesting. Yeah, you're rather the envy of many a smaller program. Yeah. Siri, would you like to talk about the Alaska Native Language Center?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I have some slides that I'll talk through. So I'm going to talk through this in a kind of a story, because the Alaska Native Language Archive can only be explained by talking about the history of the Alaska Native Language Center. On this slide, that as an opener, this is a picture of an archival project that I was doing, where I was playing older recordings taken from the archive to people in the village of Minto and asking them for commentary and correction on the way that they were identified. Next slide, please. So what is there in the language archive? You have recordings and transcriptions and publications and copies of things. Then they represent language in some way, but they're not language, as Mary pointed out. However, they can support language maintenance and revitalization only if they remain available to the people who know what to do with them. And available has a meaning. It means that they're protected, preserved in some way, but it also means they have to be accessible. And to be accessible means not only that you can find them in some way online or by looking in a catalog of some kind, but also usable by the people who need to use them. Mary touched on this too, that sometimes the thing in the archive doesn't look like something you could easily access for your own work in language revitalization, but it could be. You just might need to go through some steps in order to have it available to you. Next slide, please. So what's in this archive? About 1,500 linear feet of manuscripts. And this slide says, including nearly everything written in or about Alaska Native languages. Well, that was Dr. Krauss's idea. Well, who's this guy? Dr. Krauss Michael Krauss was a linguist who founded the Alaska Native Language Center. And it was his notion that his collection, which this is, the Krauss collection, his collection should contain everything that was written in or about Alaska Native languages. Now, when you say everything, what does that mean? You have to remember that he started working in Alaska in the early 1960s. And at the time, it was not so easy to talk to people across the world. It really was not. And it was not so easy to get hold of documents from a distance. So he wanted to have a collection that had everything, that not only the things that your work that you'd done, that you'd put away, but also the work that somebody else had done maybe many, many years ago that you might need to read in order to do your homework to do that language work. So there are the two sides to this collection: the preparation for the language worker and the results of the work. The number of recordings is probably about 5,000. There may actually be more. Next slide, please. So this is continuation of the story of Krauss's work. You can see Krauss in two of those pictures. In the black and white one, he is the guy apparently trying to look modest, writing on a blackboard, and his staff sitting around him, Alaska Native and non-Native people working with him at that time. And the other, in the color picture next to it, it's many, many years later, and he's messing about in his paper collection, which at that time was in the same building as the language center, with all of the offices of the people who were working with language. There's a picture of cassette tapes. Many things came to the collection in that form, many also in the form of reel-to-reel, and of course, cards. There are always cards and shoeboxes in a language archive. And so this slide also tells you a bit of the history too. So in the early 1970s, the state of Alaska was beginning to build its university in a really big way. And one of the things that happened was that there was legislation to found a number of institutes at the University of Alaska. At that time, the University of Alaska Fairbanks was the only campus, and it's still the main campus. So there is legislation. There is an actual act of the Alaska legislature that says there will be a language center. And that's a little unusual for this kind of an institution, but we're very proud of it, and we hang on to it very tightly, because institutes and other institutions in the humanities often come and go with the winds of change in universities. And this legislation is probably one of the main reasons that there still is a language center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Krauss's fierce support of it, of course, was another. And the fact that it really has been a very successful institute that has created a lot of work that's been useful to people. Next slide, please. So this is where the timeline gets interesting. So from 1972 to 1999, there was stable support coming from the state and from the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And it wasn't directed through projects. So there were state-funded positions for people to work at the language center. And this is really important, because when you are creating materials for languages, especially languages that are threatened, as all of the Alaskan languages are, it takes a really long time to create a good dictionary, for example. We joke that the Koyukon Athabascan dictionary, one of the biggest ones that has been created here, it took 100 years to do, because the first parts of it were written by a Catholic priest named Jules Jeté, who was working on the Yukon River in the Koyukon area for many years. He wrote a grammar of the language that was never published. And nearly a century later, Eliza Jones, Koyukon speaker and linguist, worked with other linguists at the Alaska Native Language Center to finish the book. It took them 25 years. It came out in the year 2000. It's a wonderful book, but it really takes a long time to make these things. You don't get all of this material together and get it to be understood and get it to be a usable product without spending really a lot of time. It's not project work. So this ongoing steady support was a really, really important part of the very productive time between 72 and 99. After 1999, when Dr. Krauss retired, everybody continued to work, but there was much decreased support from the state and from the university. And also at the same time, very rapid growth through digitization. So you get more and more things that you have to take care of by multiplying through digitization. And this is coupled with changes in support where everything becomes much more project-based, and there's no longer a steady commitment to the language work. So the next slide is kind of a picture of that. So on the left, there's the physical Alaska Native Language Archive, which was just a room full of paper and recordings, physical recordings. And there was some money and there was support. And then you go into this period of project supported work. So you get little bits here and there, you get little pieces. And each of the little pieces has to come with promises that say, I will make this, which means that as you get the project money, you're making more things. You might not think that digitization creates more things. Oh, those are just different versions of the same thing. But no, that's not true. A digital object is an object, and it has to be cared for, and it has to be taken into the future through migration so that you always have a copy of that thing. So when you go through a period like this where you're always making new stuff, you end up with a lot more stuff. So this is this part of the story of this archive. And it's important to know that institutions that are doing this work they really have to be supported. They have to be supported in a steady way and not through a constant building of more stuff that has to be supported. The project culture. This is what it creates. Next slide, please. So here's some things that I've learned. I was the archive director for only 2 years before I moved into the directorship of the Language Center. And I learned a lot of things. I didn't come in as an archivist or a librarian. I came in as a linguist who had contributed to the archive and used it a great deal, but I did not know what a big responsibility it was. And it was a very educational experience. Now, an archive like this one, it should be a backup. It's a place where you take care of things. But the linguists at ANLC and the people working with them in all different capacities didn't use it just as an archive. You've used it as a workroom as well. And that model, which started way back when it was just a personal library, that model is what people are wanting to do with archive materials now. And it is what works the best. It's really very much like that breath of life model that Mary talked about. So looking to the past and looking to the future, we see something that really works well, but it's not easy to do. It's really not easy to do. It takes a lot of different kinds of skills and a lot of different kinds of support for the materials. It has to be a place that you can return to work with things that have been done before, and then put the products of your work back in. When I work with people who are looking to do revitalization, who want to use archival materials, they're sometimes really flummoxed when they first take a look at them. They're not sure how they should take possession of them. And they should have possession of them, but to have something of that type means to be able to use it. And that means that knowledge has to come with that, skills have to come with that, and confidence and agency have to come with that. And once you've got that working, once people have the things and can use the things, that's when the cycle is working. That's when the cycle is working, because you've got the stuff from the past, you've got the person who understands it and has something good that they can do with it. And then you can see the products that they create go back into the archive, and that keeps the cycle going. The picture here, the picture of Linda Charlie. This was another of the projects where I was playing old recorded things to Minto people, and this in this particular case, it was songs that had been recorded by a Swedish researcher many years ago, and many of them had been labeled wrong, or they nobody quite understood what they were supposed to be about. And Linda, who was she was blind, and she listened better than anybody in that community. She was so good at listening, and then very quietly telling me something about that song that then we could put back into the record. That's the kind of thing that you want to be trying to do. At the same time, that in that project, another thing that we were able to do is to bring recordings back from Sweden, because I was collaborating with a Swedish researcher, Håkan Lundström, from Lund University. And he had been the person who worked on those songs with the original researcher, although he had never been to Minto until I took him there. And he had transcribed what he could transcribe without having a dictionary of the language or knowledge of the language. So we brought back those recordings and many pictures that the researcher had taken as well to give people in Minto. So this is the kind of cyclic work that I love. I think it's the most exciting kind of work we can do. Next slide, please. So here's an example. The story about the songs is one, but this is actually very concrete. Okay, this is Michael Krauss's transcription of a piece of a story. This is a story from Minto, and it's about a greedy and selfish owl who does not provide enough food for his wife. And you can see that this is his handwritten, pen-written notes, which he took down after recording the story. And as he was working with the storyteller, Moses Charlie, in subsequent sessions, he was adding a few little notes below it. So it's hard to read. It's very faint. You have to looking. This is the digital version. If you look at the physical version, you can read it a little bit better, but it's really quite difficult. You have to know how he wrote the language. You have to have a notion about the language itself. You know, where would I be looking for the noun in that sentence? Where would I be looking for the verb? And there's a lot you need to know in order to interpret that version. And the next slide. Here's some work that was done by another linguist, James Kari, on the same story. Now he's actually taking it out, he's typing it. He's writing it in a different writing system, which is easier to read and which had been adopted by the language community. He's still not glossing very many words, so that if you did not know what some of those words meant, you would have to do some homework as you went. But you can see, so Jim has written, his stomach swelled up and then his eyes turned yellow. Oh, okay, something's happening with this guy. But what? While what's happening to the owl? I still don't get it. Next slide. So in 2015, Dr. Krauss and I got in touch with one of the few people who could actually translate this story well, Silas, who is from Minto. And he and Sarah and I sat with the transcriptions of this story. We didn't have the recording. The recording had been lost. So we were recording what Sarah did as we read it back to her. Dr. Krauss and I read this back to her, and she helped us to translate and finish the story. And we were, what I was doing with this, the reason the screen looks like this is I was using a program called Elan, which allows you to align the recording you have with the way that you've transcribed it. A very, very handy tool for people working with language. So now we've gotten a little bit further. We actually have some glossing for more of the words. We can tell more about what's going on in the story, but we're not quite done yet. There's one more slide, next one. And now you could actually read it with a more or less smooth translation. Ara yeda naida nektsako babet iradulta. Kubanara banara ha akut del thuksa. Davanich dinako ada. Well, okay, so the thing that happened to the owl is that his wife had decided to take revenge for his greediness and selfishness. And so she melted some fat and she caught him and tied him up and she fed him that fat, just fed it to him and fed it to him until his eyes turned yellow. And you know that this particular kind of owl does have yellow eyes, so you know that it all has to be true. So that's the end of that story. Next slide. The whole thing I want you to remember is that if an archive is a project, it's like a 100-year project at least. So we have to be thinking that far ahead. We have to be thinking about the people who need to use it a long time from now. And we really have to put thought into it so that it will be there for somebody else to find another story that needs to be worked on that way. And here's, for some reason, this is the only person I have in my story who wasn't from Mincho. That's Virginia Pete from Taslina. She's an Otna speaker listening to a wonderful story about cannibals. That's the end of my talk. And thank you so much for listening to me. Besicho.
Thank you, Siri. Well, we have a lot of questions in the question and answer, but feel free to add yours. There, you should find a Q&A box either at the bottom or top of your screen. Did you guys have any questions for each other at all? And if not, I'll move to the questions from our attendees.
I'm looking forward to hearing what they ask.
Some really, really good questions. I think one of them, let's do this one for both of you. How have you seen your field shift from when you first started? Maybe also how maybe the program has changed as well. And how has technology helped or altered your work? Kaiulani, you want to try that one first, or?
Sure, I can. I think, well, with Aha Punana Leo specifically, I'm relatively new to the organization, being that it started in '83. But over the years, I think that, when we're looking at technology and all of that, I think it's helped. Just language revitalization in general, it makes a lot of things a lot more accessible. It helps to create new spaces for people to learn language, and so for us to support our families. That's probably one of the biggest components of a successful language nest for us anyway, is to have a really strong commitment from the families to the program and to help their child be successful. And a lot of our families are coming to the program with an English speaking household. So I think that having technology, having accessibility has helped to progress the Hawaiian language movement. And I think over the years, we've seen generations now go through our programs where we have graduates of our preschool who went through their full Hawaiian medium education program and now have their own children who are participating in the program. Of course, that kind of component strengthens everything to do with language. So I think I answered the question, but yes, we've seen a lot of change and progress there.
Yeah. Siri, did you have anything to add?
There's a couple of things that I didn't talk about with in the archive area. So when I went to graduate school, studying documentation was really not a thing. And in order to learn to do documentation, I kind of had to do two fields of study. I did all my technical stuff in my graduate school program, but then I also spent a great deal of time in the field just learning it on the street, basically. now we have programs where people learn to do documentation and revitalization, and that is pretty exciting. Another thing that has changed is that I think in the 90s, I really did not meet any younger people in language communities who were involved in language work. And that had changed by 2000. All of a sudden, there are these fierce, exciting young language warriors showing up and really willing to commit to a great deal of work. Mm-hmm. And it's so exciting and so inspiring to work with those people. And I just hope we can keep supporting them as we go on.
Yeah, I agree. I was told I couldn't get a PhD with a grammar of a language, even though to do a grammar you have to know just about everything about linguistics. So, yeah, yes, and really the enthusiasm within communities for using their languages, revitalizing their language. There's still a long way to go with that, but. And then also, as you touched on too, a lot of these language warriors are becoming academics themselves. So the field of language revitalization, there is really a field of language revitalization now, and there wasn't before. And it's really changing our methodology to indigenize our methodology. I mean, even the best-hearted people, when I was younger, you did descriptive work, but then you gave back to the community by some help or doing something. But it's really changed into really collaboration, working with, to even moving to, the main people doing the work in North America are often community linguists that are in academia. So there's a strong core of young indigenous linguists. And that's exciting of how it's even changing the way we look and analyze language as well, not just how we collect or document and describe the language. So it's a really exciting time, I think, it's a revolutionary time in linguistics, I feel. So it really has changed a lot. There's a question that we often get, all of us get, and that is, can you explain to others why it's worth investing in these smaller languages? Why maintain these languages or revitalize them? This is, I think, all of us working in any part of this field gets asked this question. And so it's a good question. It's a good question to answer.
Well, I worked with a language with one speaker for my dissertation. Mm-hmm. And the Salcha dialect of Tanana. And she passed away part of the way through my work. And then I brought in my work to work with the people downriver in Minto. We'd speak a different dialect. And I ended up comparing the two. Why is it worth doing that? Well, I always ask people, don't you want to know more things? What's wrong with knowing more things? But also, I think we are very willing to go out and look for rare plants that might cure diseases. We're willing to support little animals that might, and in the end, solve some great world problem for us. What if the Salcha dialect of Tanana contained the only story that could inspire people after a great pandemic? That speaker watched her whole village go down in the 1918 flu. Some of her stories, which I have yet to finish because they were so emotional, I could not actually face them. Some of those stories might actually help us remember not to do the things that we've done in the past regarding helping each other with public health. That's just one example. I think it's not just the language, it's the things that people said in it, of course. And what they said in it was representing the things that their culture had learned over thousands and thousands of years. Mm-hmm. It's all, yes. Don't you want to know more things?
Kaiulani, I think it's very personal for you, this answer.
It is. And I feel like there's a number of different angles that I could answer that question from. But really what it comes down to for us here in Hawaii is that our Hawaiian people had such a strong connection with place and their aina, and the relationship that they had allowed them to thrive in a way that was sustainable and really in a thriving community. And I think for having a people who went through the history that we went through, we have a lot of people who are still seeking their identity and what is that, and it's a confusing time, it's a confusing thing. So to be able to use Hawaiian language to bring people together, to learn traditional ways of being, and to really set foundations for families through a Hawaiian cultural lens is really important. And it really just brings some strength to the families and the communities that they live in, and how we treat people, how we work with people in various different settings. And I think that that's really the key of it. And to me, that's what makes Hawaii Hawaii. And that's why so many people love it here, and tourism is our economic driver, which we're not seeing much of right now. But I think that knowing that there was something that people loved about it, at one point or another, there was something that was just totally loved. And it has to do with the people and how we are here, how we treat the land, the beauty of this place. And I think that all ties back to the language.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And language is considered a basic human right in the UN the rights of Indigenous people, the right to speak the language of your choice and to pass it on to your children. And living in the United States, we tend to think that English is indomitable, but there are, in the history of the world, there's lots of major dominant languages that didn't just die out by changing into another language, but died out, right? In other ways. And when you think about it on the personal terms of speaking to your grandmother, I cannot imagine not being able to speak to my grandmother, or at least not being able to speak to her in the language that she grew up speaking. So not really being able to really understand or talk with her. And that's what we're looking at in immigrant populations, but also in Indigenous and minoritized groups, is that fundamental connection to family, to place, as you said, and the right for people to have that connection. So, no matter how small the language is. So, yeah. Wow, we have a lot of questions, which is a really good thing. There's a question here that's probably more apt to Siri, but I'm going to change it a little bit for you as well, Kaiolani. It's about working with languages that don't have any alphabet or any writing system, and how you record or preserve languages that aren't traditionally written. Tape recorders are nice.
So the linguists who do documentation are trained to listen to the sounds of speech and record the sound itself, the phonetic sound, so that if you actually don't know anything about a piece of speech, you can start by using the International Phonetic Alphabet. But in order to create an orthography or a writing system, you have to learn how the language works, because speech sounds are organized. They're not random. And so that it takes quite a bit of time for one of those to be developed. I've had more experience working with writing systems that were already created and that people wanted to change or another. And that's kind of interesting, because the creation of the orthography, because it is such a really quite an intellectual task, people are very proud of the writing systems they've created. And sometimes they think of them as their analyses and they fight for them. even when they're not working as well for the readers of the language. So that can be an interesting dynamic, let's say.
Yeah, especially older orthographies were often, created by outsiders. Some of them are beautiful and are still in use today, and some of them are just tragic. So, but yeah, the community has to embrace it in order for it to be used. Yeah. So I was going to change it a little bit because and it's not really the preschool program that you're part of, but as Hawaiian students move through the system and go to grade school and high school, could you talk about how they introduce English literacy? Because the students do come out fully literate in English as well. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So one of our partner schools, it's a charter school, Nawahi, they actually start introducing English in grade 5. And I think it's important to note that, we live in a English speaking world. So while they're going to school and getting, 100% Hawaiian language at school, sometimes in the home, their communities, the signs they see and all of that are in English. So it's a lot easier to introduce a language that they've already been somewhat immersed in their daily life. But we actually had a program that taught Japanese and Latin through the medium of Hawaiian language before introducing English. So it just creates a really, really nice kind of a worldview on other languages out there. And it gives these kids a look into the real world and, knowing that there are other languages out there to kind of preface their introduction into standard English. So I think that that's just a really interesting way that we've tried to make sure that they're proficient in both English and Hawaiian and also get exposed to some other languages along the way. And then all of the children that do graduate from grade 12 from that school, they have an opportunity to get the seal of biliteracy in Hawaiian language and English as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I wanted that to emphasize that your students, the children, are fully bilingual, if not multilingual, when they come out. I think a lot of them speak Hawaiian Pidgin as well, plus other languages that they learn, including Japanese. And so, okay, there's an interesting question here about connections, and it's more specific to Athabasca or to Alaska, about any in your research or other researchers, if there's any connection with American Indian languages with other languages of the old world. So in using Alaska as a byway. And I think, would you like to speak briefly about that, Siri? I think there's controversy.
Certainly among in the Yupik languages, there are Yupik languages spoken on both sides of Bering Strait. So yes, Alaskan languages are spoken in the old world and in between on the island. So there is a very interesting theory that's been developed regarding some languages spoken in Siberia. And specifically the Ket language, which is a Yeniseian language run from the Yeniseian River, and relationships between that and the Dene languages of the Americas. And the interesting thing about this is the Ket and the Dene languages, which include Athabascan languages of Alaska, Canada, and the Southwest and the Pacific coast, they're just a little bit too similar for the time depth that we sometimes think about as relating to the travels over the land bridge, right? So it's a really interesting thing to look at, though, because the characteristics that make you think languages are related, it's not just if they say mother the same way. You have to have a whole lot of words that are similar in a structured way, but then even more so if the way the words go together is similar in structure, then you're going, whoa, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the case with the Dene-Yeniseian hypothesis. It has been discussed a lot. Quite a bit has been written about it now. And so several very good historical linguists seem to think it's not such a bad idea. So, yep, why should there not be a connection? People do go back and forth.
Yep. Thank you. We have only a few minutes left, and Amanda Rosenberg has a wonderful question I thought we could end with if we each take a little, answer it shortly. What is one thing that people assume about your work, and what is one thing you wish they knew more about your work? So, I know. Who wants to start?
Would you like to start?
Yolani, you want to start?
Sure, I'll take a try at that one. I think for us, I guess one of the most interesting things to me is the recognition that we have locally compared to internationally or nationally with language revitalization. And in the field of language revitalization, I think that, many people know about us. Whereas locally, we are still very much a small little community who are, we need to be just as dedicated as we were 40 years ago. And while we've seen a tremendous strengthening of Hawaiian language in the communities that we're in, we're in the same position that we were 40 years ago, in a sense, in the sense that we could see it slip away just as quickly as it once did. And I think that is a hard reality to face. But I think that we know that we have a lot of boundaries that are currently out there. Some of them are just personal mental boundaries of not being able to realize what a thriving Hawaiian language would be like in our community. And what we like to say now is that we're trying to normalize the language. I think that we're trying to get beyond this point of trying to save it. And we're trying to normalize it so that it actually is back to the state that it once was. And to me, that is where the preservation of it would be, to a state that it actually was living, and you see it everywhere, similar like to when you go to a different country outside of the United States. Why isn't that here? We had a thriving language where we're completely isolated, physically. And I would love to see that would be attainable one day. And I think that is probably the biggest misconception for us, is that we're in a good place. We're all good already. But we have a lot of work ahead of us. And I'm hoping that over the next few decades, we get a lot closer to that, and we get to push outside of the boundaries of education and into different industry sectors where our graduates can actually live their life using Hawaiian language. So I think that would be our goal.
Yep. A truly bilingual or multilingual Hawaiian, islands. Yep. Siri, we may not have time, so it's.
I kind of liked for the way Kaiulani left.
I think she ended it wonderfully. Yes. So
Sorry.
thank you all very much. Mahalo, and thank you, Sale Kayasada. It's good what you are doing. And thank you all for joining us today for the Women in Preservation Symposium 2021. Thank you.